Ecclesiastes 1:12 through 18. And Ecclesiastes is my go-to book of the Bible when I feel overwhelmed. So I will read for you. This is likely from Solomon. I, the teacher, when king over Israel and Jerusalem, applied my mind to seek and to search out by wisdom all that is done under heaven. It is an unhappy business that God has given to human beings to be busy with. I saw all the deeds that are done under the sun, and see, all is vanity and chasing after wind. What is crooked cannot be made straight, and what is lacking cannot be counted. I said to myself, I have acquired great wisdom, surpassing all who were over Jerusalem before me, and my mind has had great experience of wisdom and knowledge. And I applied my mind to know wisdom and to know madness and folly. I perceive that this also is but a chasing after wind. For in much wisdom is much vexation, and those who increase knowledge increase sorrow. Our second reading, not even a little bit more encouraging than that one, comes from Romans 7. I've chosen some selected verses. This is from Paul. It's good to know that Paul was pretty much a master of rhetoric and used language as a tool. So it's very useful to listen to not only what he is saying, but how he is saying it and toward what end he is saying it. And now let's hear the words of Paul. Once I was alive apart from the law, but when the commandment came, sin sprang to life and I died. I found that the very commandment that was intended to bring life actually brought death. Did that which is good then become death to me? By no means. Nevertheless, in order that sin might be recognized as sin, it used what is good to bring about my death, so that through the commandment sin might become utterly sinful. We know that the law is spiritual, but I am unspiritual, sold as a slave to sin. I do not understand what I do. For what I want to do, I do not do, but what I hate, I do. And if I do what I do not want to do, I agree that the law is good. As it is no longer I myself who do it, but it is sin living in me. For I know what good itself does not dwell in me, that is, in my sinful nature. But I have the desire to do what is good, but I cannot carry it out. For I do not do the good I want to do, but the evil I do not want to do, this I keep on doing. Now, if I do what I do or what I do not want to do, it is no longer I who do it, but the sin living in me that does it. What a wretched man I am. Who will rescue me from this body that is subjected to death? Thanks be to God who delivers me through Jesus Christ our Lord. So then I myself in my mind am a slave to God's law, but in my sinful nature, a slave to the law of sin. Words to chew on. Thanks be to God. You may be seated. Let us pray. God with us. May the word that is near us, on our lips and in our hearts, illumine this conversation this day, revealing to us our capacity to be the hands and feet of Christ to this world. Amen. Some of you know, about a month ago, I went on a civil rights pilgrimage and visited many sites along the Civil Rights Trail in Atlanta and Alabama. I won't get deeply into the reasoning behind it right now. Some of that will be revealed as we continue in our conversations over weeks and months and days to come. But one of the things that I want to bring back from that experience was a question that kept ringing in my mind. Why do we wait so long? Why do we wait so long? When you look at the experiences of the people who have walked through that civil rights experience from the earliest of days up until now, there's always been the desire to live into that just and beloved kingdom right now. There's something in our hearts that tells us that it is real right here and right now, and yet for some reason, we continue to wait. And so that's why I call the title, The Weight of the World. Just the weight, meaning the pressure that comes down on us, and then the time that we allow things to take, the time that we push things off. And so that is informing some of what I'm sharing this morning. So I want to start off by going into a little bit of history. This is a little bit of Frederick Douglass's history. In 1848, Frederick Douglass wrote a letter, an open letter, to his former master, let's say. And he came down on him about slavery and the cruel and just system. And he said to him in that open letter, "I intend to make use of you as a weapon with which to assail the system of slavery." And then he did something at the end which was somewhat surprising. He said, "I entertain no malice towards you personally. There's no roof under which you would be more safe than mine," he says to his former master. "And there's nothing in my house which you might need for your comfort, which I would not readily grant." And he ends it by saying, "I am your fellow man, but not your slave." In 1877, at the request of his former master, Thomas Auld, Captain Thomas Auld, Douglass returned to the land of his former enslavement and had an emotional conversation with Thomas Auld. And he had already had a relationship with Thomas's daughter for 20 years because she had come to hear Frederick speak at some of his talks on abolition. And this is what Thomas Auld said to him. He said, "Frederick, I always knew you were too smart to be a slave. And had I been in your place, I should have done as you did," meaning I would have run away also, because Frederick had run away from slavery and they had sent bounty hunters to find him and everything. And he said, "I always knew. And if I were in your place, I would have done what you did." Now, there's more to the story than this, so if you haven't already, I encourage you to read the life and times of Frederick Douglass. But what I want to point out to you is what Thomas Auld said. He said, "I always knew. I always knew." Now, mind you, he didn't say I always knew the institution of slavery was wrong, only that Frederick was too smart to be a slave. But that omission alone has to make one wonder, if he always knew, why was he not able to act on what he knew and give Frederick his freedom, rather than make that admission decades later after Douglass had escaped and achieved so much as an abolitionist, an orator, an ambassador, and at the time of their meeting, a U.S. statesman, which is an extraordinary life, imagine, in the context out of which it emerged. And there's only one word that I can think of that can make sense somewhat of the delayed admission, and that word is justification. In his book, The Righteous Mind, Why Good People Are Divided by Politics and Religion, author Jonathan Haidt says, "We should not expect individuals to produce good, open-minded, truth-seeking reasoning, particularly when self-interest or reputational concerns are in play." And he says this because, according to his research and general observation, the vast majority of us do not use logical reasoning to make moral decisions, but rather we use this capacity to justify decisions that we've already made or have been made for us by the institutions to which we subscribe. And perhaps it was this wisdom that Douglass tapped into that allowed him to forgive Thomas Auld and acknowledge that in some way they both were victims of the times they were born into, times that dictated him to be master and Douglass as slave, which is what Douglass said to him. Only Douglass could find no justification for slavery. He also knew he should not be a slave, just like Thomas Auld knew, and he took action on what he knew in his heart, and he did so with all deliberate speed. So let me ask you, have you ever always known something, but somehow couldn't get yourself to do anything about it? And it doesn't have to be something grand. It doesn't have to be something extraordinary. It could be, I always knew I should have washed those dishes before my wife got home. I'm guilty of that one quite a bit. But there's some gap between what we know and what we do sometimes. And depending on the degree to which that difficulty is, sometimes we can justify it a lot more easier than we can in other situations. And so I'm assuming that most of us have had a similar situation. One person that we know had such a situation was John Newton, who wrote Amazing Grace that we just sung. And a lot of people know that he was once a slave trader and that he had a conversion experience on one of the slave ships, and then he ended up becoming a minister, and he wrote this song that is one of the most known songs throughout all Christianity, and no matter what your denomination is. But what some people don't know is it wasn't like an instant conversion. Even though it says the hour I first believed in the song, it was more like the hour I first believed, and then I waited some years, and then I had some other experiences, and eventually I lived into it. And this is not a condemnation against John Newton, but awareness of humanity. That sometimes we learn things and we know things, and then before we can actually fully live into them, there's a process that we have to go through. In our first passage this morning from Ecclesiastes, this wise man Solomon said, that there's much vexation in seeking wisdom, and that those who increase their knowledge increase sorrow. Now, that doesn't sound very uplifting because, you want to know things, right? But at the same time, when we know things, very often there is some grief that comes from what we thought we knew before. That there are mistakes and things that we do with good intentions under one set of circumstances, and then when we come into this new knowledge, we go, oh my goodness, I didn't know. And then we go through a period of grief. Now, some of us, when we go through that period of grief, we say, this hurts too much. Let me stop this and let me justify it. And then some of us say, oh my God, I never want to feel this kind of grief again. Let me continue to learn. Let me know more, and let me do everything I can to live into it. Again, this is not with any judgment. This is a very human experience. But I think the important thing is to be aware that this is part of the human experience. That as we engage with others, as we engage with the world outside of our own walls, that we are going to come in contact with knowledge. And that after that knowledge, there's going to probably be some increased sorrow. And yet, we must move forward. In the past few years or more, many of us have learned things, and we've been discouraged by what we've learned. In the past few weeks, with the shootings that have happened, and the situation with immigration in this country right now, we feel a lot of things. And when that knowledge comes up, what do we feel? We feel increased sorrow. Sometimes we feel grief for what we thought we knew. But then what do we do after that? That is the question. So there's a few other points in history I'm going to point out to just for our edification. One of them is there's a pastor from Dallas, Texas, some years ago. His name was George Washington Truett. And he said some words that really, really resonated with me. He said, to know the will of God is the greatest knowledge. To find the will of God is the greatest discovery. To do the will of God is the greatest achievement. If I could ever come up with words that encapsulate the desire of my heart, it would be those words. To know the will of God is the greatest knowledge. To find the will of God is the greatest discovery. To do the will of God is the greatest achievement. Those words from Truett were so profound to me, and I found them out of context. I had no idea who he was. And I thought if I ever knew who this guy was, I feel we'd have a great conversation. And so I looked and I started looking into Truett, and I found that he was a pastor, a Baptist pastor, and I came from that similar background. And I said, yes, of course, we'd have so many things that we could talk about. And I read some of his sermons, and they spoke to my heart, and they go so deep. And they're very profound, I think, for his time, the times that he was living in the late 19th and early 20th century. And this man's words were so powerful that he did a lot of amazing things in his life. And one of them was that he took his church of 700 members and he grew it to 7,000 members in a global ministry when they didn't have the internet and all sorts of things. And I was very excited to learn more about him, and I got a book of his sermons, and I read some of them. And I didn't read the introduction before reading it. I just wanted to get into the sermons, and I really liked it. And then, for some reason, I decided to go back and read the introduction. After reading some of his sermons, like Be Still and Know That I'm God, and we would see Jesus. And I felt discouraged by what I read in the introduction. Now, these are not his words. It was someone introducing him. But I want you to hear the words. And these are from Reverend John E. White, Doctor of Divinity. And I quote from his introduction, which he entitled George Washington Truett, the Man and the Preacher. He wrote, "In the gallery of the South's strong men, men who are at the front of moral leadership and her marvelous progress, the picture of George W. Truett would not lack much of the foremost place were the vote left to the admiration of the more than 2 million white Baptists of the Southern Baptist Convention." White Baptists of the Southern Baptist Convention. Now, I'm almost embarrassed to say that in some way it broke my heart to read that. But I got myself to know him, I thought, through the scriptures. And I'm not condemning him because everybody has to deal with the times that they're in. But I can say that it did hurt me. You see, I read that introduction late. Had I read it before, I might not have ever read the sermon. So I say that it's God's divine order, the order that I read it. But some of the things I want to say about Truett are, when he didn't have to, at a time when patriarchal language abounded, he would numerous times in his sermons use women as examples of spiritual and moral leaders in their families and communities. And when discussing the compassion of Christ expressed in the story of feeding the multitudes found in Matthew, he encouraged his parishioners to not be like the disciples who told Jesus to send the hungry people away, but rather to be like Christ, who said to the disciples, "They need not go away, you give them something to eat." And bringing it closer to home, he invited his congregation to consider who they might be tempted to send away. What did they not want to face in their world? Were they going to be like the disciples and try to take what he called the ostrich method, that is sticking their head in the sand and saying, "There's nothing we can do. We don't have the resources. All we have is 5 loaves and 2 fishes. What you are asking us to do can't be done"? Or would they have the faith to do what Jesus demonstrated and make the most of what they did have in service of those in need? And in a bold rebuke of the contrary mentality, he said to his congregations that if the disciples had their way and sent the hungry away and those people died in their hunger, they would have been guilty of murder on a wholesale scale. So it was a good thing that they didn't stop that at "it can't be done." But in the midst of their unbelief, they listened to Jesus and handed what they had over to him, and it somehow became more than enough. And that's why he said, we can't be indifferent to the cry of human need anywhere in the world. And echoing Jesus' admonition found later in the same gospel, Truett reminded them that Jesus said that what we do to the least, we do to him. And then he listed some examples of his own church. And then he talked about being tempted to turn away those such as people from Jamaica or China or Congo, none of whom are white. And I love that sermon of Truett's. And so even though I knew that the Southern Baptist Convention was founded in 1845 in order to uphold its opposition to the anti-slavery sentiments of the North, after listening to and reading many of his sermons, I found it hard to imagine that George Washington Truett necessarily had any conscious racist sentiments in his heart. And yet, it would seem that at a minimum, he overlooked how keeping the distinction that Reverend White made when he explicitly said the words 2 million white Baptists of the Southern Baptist Convention in the introduction. And I wonder, was it because everybody was white anyway? Possibly, but then why have to say it? He could have said 2 million members. And if everyone wasn't white, then saying Baptist, which is the Southern Baptist Convention, so it's redundant to say Baptist of the Southern Baptist Convention anyway, unless there's some legitimacy that he held toward white Baptists that he didn't hold for Baptists that weren't white. I don't know because I wasn't there, and I don't know what's in his heart. Only God knows. But I do know that when we look back on history, I have to wonder, how can someone like Truett, no offense to Truett, who clearly loved people, had a strong ministry, and yet that one little thing, maybe he knew, but he couldn't do what he knew. Every day, we're faced with these opportunities to do what we know or to do what we do. And for a long time, being human, it seemed like a legitimate excuse. I'm only human. Or we hear people's cry for justice and we say, we agree with you, but can you wait a little while? Just a little bit longer. Don't rush. It's what we do. But we have opportunity to live what we know right now, to practice it like we do when we get together on Sundays and we greet one another. We have this opportunity to be miracles in this world. Each and every one of you, in small ways. I'll tell you one more quick story. It's from his book, In the Shadow of Statues by Mitch Landrieu, former mayor of New Orleans. And he made a decision to confront the issue of the statues of the Confederacy in his community. And he admitted and wrote in his book, slavery was the reason for the war, and as we learn in unknown blinkered histories, Southerners protecting their traditional way of life committed horrendous moral crimes against people of African descent. And yet in 1884, when the Lee statue was installed, the Daily Picayune captured a mindset of prevailing power. We cannot ignore the fact that the secession has been stigmatized as treason, and that the purest and bravest men in the South have been denounced as guilty of a shameful crime. By every application of literature and art, we must show it to all coming ages that with us at least there dwells no sense of guilt. And so Landrieu thought he had to face this, and this is how he made that decision. He said, here I am in my second term, thinking, if anyone can get rid of those symbols, it's me. A future African-American mayor would face excruciating struggle with this because of the way power and money undulate in this city. And it would turn into an ugly referendum on race with the voices of a sentimental South that stands on whitewashed history, raising a protest about heritage and honor and not slavery. And Landrieu was right, because the mayor that followed him was an African-American mayor. He knew it, and then he did it. He started that conversation. He didn't wait for that conversation to be started, because he knew his place in history. We each have a place in history because we're here. We're making history right now, each and every one of us. Paul struggled saying, the things that I want to do, I don't do. The things I don't want to do, those are the things I do. And Paul basically just said, I'm human. But he also said something else. He later said that he prayed that we might be able to comprehend the love of Christ that surpasses knowledge. Because you see, when we increase knowledge, we do increase our sorrow. But that's knowledge without love. But when we receive knowledge and we apply love to what we learn, there's no limits to the good that can be done. We saw it with Landrieu. We see it with each other every day, with the members of this church and the things they do. The fact that we participate in the NAACP, all sorts of things, which I should say were started by white people, just in case some people didn't know, just a brief history. We have an opportunity here. And yes, we are going to be discouraged, but be of good courage, because the world can be overcome every time you greet a neighbor as yourself. Every time you seek to love with a love that surpasses knowledge. And that's what we're doing here. And so I pray, as I often do, that we take this opportunity to heart. That we look at one another as the hands and the feet of Christ that we are. And that we encourage one another along this journey. Because the beloved community is not far from us, but dwells within us. And every day we have a chance to bring it out. And you do so anytime you get a chance. Thanks be to God.